Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's continuation of the Leadership Webinar Series. My name is Jason Fisher. I'm a PGY2 up at Hartford Hospital pursuing the ESIR tract and one of the chairs for the RFS Communications Committee. Before we continue the leadership series tonight, just want to remind everyone that tonight's session will be recorded and uploaded to YouTube for later viewing. So with that, I'll turn it over to Alex, who will introduce our speaker for the evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for spending your evening with us. I'm Alexandra Kutsenko, and I'm a chair of the Advocacy Committee for SIR-RFS and Radiology resident at SUNY Upstate University Hospital. Today, we're presenting the Leadership Webinar Series that were developed by the RFS Women in IR Committee, with the goal to educate, support, and encourage interventional radiology physicians to build successful careers, acquire leadership skills, and potentially obtain administrative positions within the healthcare system. Today, we are conducting our 8th session on political and healthcare leadership. I'm honored to introduce one of the most prominent IR leaders, Dr. Steve Ferrara. He is presenting on political advocacy. You are either at the table or on the menu. Dr. Ferrara is a former chief medical officer for the U.S. Navy, the first radiologist to win a competitive congressional primary and become a nominee for the United States Congress in 2018. He is also a former SIR Advocacy, Health Policy, and Economics Committee chair. He has great interest in supporting residents and fellows and was a resident program director for 6 years in San Diego and then started a first IR training program in Phoenix, Arizona. Dr. Ferrara is the first interventional radiology combat veteran who in 2009 volunteered to serve in Afghanistan as an IR physician. He transformed combat casualty care by pioneering endovascular surgical techniques on the battlefield. Over the 25 years of his career in military, Dr. Ferrara received numerous awards and recognitions, including the Legion of Merit, Defense Meritorious Service Medal, Afghanistan Campaign Medal, and the Humanitarian Service Medal. Dr. Steve Ferrara is a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Congressional Health Policy Fellow and was one of the drafters for the bill that ultimately repealed the Medicare Sustainable Growth Rate. Dr. Ferrara, we're exceptionally proud that you're sharing your experience with us tonight.
Well, thank you very much, Alex and Jason and the whole RFS for inviting me. This is, I really commend you, and I'm so impressed that with all, so many duties that you're taking the time and the initiative to put on such an incredible series. I've seen the prior 7 talks, so these are big shoes to fill, but I'm excited to try to share a little bit of my experience since I think so many of us in IR bring some unique, just like in the clinical arena, we bring some unique perspectives to advocacy and how to, best champion our specialty. So I'm eager to share that with folks tonight. So as was mentioned, we're going to be talking a little bit about political advocacy. I'm in Washington, D.C. right now, so kind of really in the heart of where a lot of this is going on, and it's a sort of a way of life here to talk about healthcare and healthcare policy. This isn't a new topic here. Thomas Jefferson, to paraphrase this quote from him, which you can read at your leisure, but he essentially says that you can have everything, but without health, there is no happiness. And so therefore, the utmost attention should be dedicated to the pursuit of health. And so I think again that we are certainly in a very exciting place, and this is a 200-plus-year-old hot issue, and it's going to remain that way. So it's great to be well prepared and well trained. This is another little bit of history, but I am a history buff, but I think this stuff helps provide context as well to sort of understand how we got to where we are. The Social Security Act, Section 1801, is the section that actually created Medicare. So what you'll see in the first sentence, it says that nothing in this title shall be construed to authorize any federal officer or employee to exercise any supervision or control over the practice of medicine. Now, I think most of us would probably find that, and that was in 1965 when Medicare was signed. So here we are 54 years later. I think the notion that that government is not involved in the practice of medicine is really almost humorous. It's almost satirical because government is so embedded. And so clearly we see how the decisions we make and how incremental change can lead us in vastly different directions than are sometimes intended, which, if anything, emphasizes the importance of getting policies and procedures correct the first time, because they will evolve. And so when we can start them from a good place and with a good foundation, we have a better chance of remaining in a good place. So the topic of this title, that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu, is a very common phrase here in Washington, D.C., but also I think this talk, and now we're talking about political advocacy, but the skills and the ideas we're going to talk about here are very translatable to every level, from the federal government to hospital committees to within your department to within state and local government. And this is a common phrase that when you're not there, people will usually make decisions on your behalf, and chances are they're not going to be the options that will be chosen for you are probably not the options that you would choose for yourself. And one of the reasons that healthcare, particularly as it relates to the government, I think is unique in that it is such a cutthroat, if you will, topic when it comes to political jockeying, is because, unlike other areas in the economy where we can think of all boats can rise, one of the challenges in healthcare, especially with such a large publicly funded component, is that the pie is relatively fixed, and the government's, one of their main priorities is reducing the rate of increased spending. So if you think of it as fixed, which it's not, because, and we'll talk about that, there is healthcare inflation, obviously, including Medicare and Medicaid, but they're trying to keep it limited. So therefore, if you say that the pie, the overall amount of dollars in the healthcare system is relatively fixed, then it has to be, there's usually winners and losers. When policies are made, for someone to do well, someone else does worse. And that really gets to the root of the title of this talk. And this gives a little bit of perspective. This is a recent estimate. This is from 2019. And what you'll see is, is in 2019, in 2018, the last year for which data are available, healthcare, the Medicare spending, not Medicaid and not commercial or whatnot, was about $600 billion, which was almost 15% of federal outlays and 3% of GDP. Healthcare overall is about 18% of GDP, so it's just the Medicare component. But you can see what it's doing. You can see that within just roughly 10 years, it's going to more than double. And in total dollars, and the percent of federal outlays continues to go up. So you can easily appreciate the pressure on policymakers to reduce this curve and to flatten this curve. That's what you'll hear all the time, is people are trying to flatten the cost curve. To put it another way that's perhaps even more dire, and again, this is from the trustees for Medicare. This is the Part A trust fund, which, if you're familiarizing yourself right now with Medicare, there's effectively like 4 components. Part A is the hospital trust fund. That's the part that's withheld from your taxes. When you see that little Medicare line item in your pay stub, that's going to Medicare Part A. So you can see that in 2019, we actually only have 7 years of solvency left in the Medicare Part A trust fund, which actually represents virtually an all-time low, because it's been 8 a couple times. So at least going back to 2005. So the Medicare Part A trust fund is based on current rate of spend. About 10,000 people a day age into Medicare. That's how many people turn 65 in America each day. So there's 10,000 new patients a day. Until this baby boomer cohort, which will be about 2024, before that subsides. So you can see why this is such a a momentous issue. So if you want to call these highlights, they're at least high points of things. Is nearly almost $1 in $5 in our U.S. economy is spent on healthcare. It's roughly $3.5 trillion now, which it's actually broke about 2 years ago. It went above $10,000 per person. So every man, woman, and child in America is basically per capita spending is over $10,000. So if you didn't use $10,000 in healthcare last year, it's because other people were kind of consuming your portion on your behalf. And that the rate of healthcare spending continues to outpace consumer inflation. And so that's kind of that curve we saw before. And actually we've been in a little bit more of a quiescent period for the last few years. It's been sort of in the lower, like the 2 to 4%, and it's anticipated to be going higher for the next several years. In fact, more like 5 or 6 or 7%, because of, again, the aging cohort, medicine's becoming more expensive. There have been upward pressures on pricing. We hear about, there's a lot of wonderful new medications out there, but you see all the time new medicines are discovered or invented that are very, very costly. They improve our patients' outcomes, but they're extremely costly, and there's more people to need to provide those medications to. So the net of that is inflation is going up at a very rapid rate. One thing that provides a great opportunity, however, and this is when I first became a congressional fellow for the Institute of Medicine in 2012, is when they released this report. So this is actually, at the time, healthcare was about $3 trillion in 2012, 7 years ago. So it's about 1 in 4 healthcare dollars were considered wasted. And so now that number would be a little bit higher, actually. But you can look at, that's more than our entire defense budget. And I think most people, some might think, gosh, that must be an overestimation, until many of us in healthcare, we start to look at it and we go, gee, do you think that 1 in 4, 1 in $5 that are spent are wasted, meaning, duplicative, not indicated, just extra stuff gets thrown out, all the ways that stuff can be wasted. A lot of us would say, oh, it might actually even be a little bit higher. So while this is, on one hand, kind of depressing statistic, we have to see this as representing an opportunity, because if we can improve on our efficiency and in reduction in waste through, better things like whether it's clinical decision support or better management of patients, better coordination of care, interoperability of the electronic health record, many ways that we can reduce, redundancy, duplication, other forms of waste, we can really bite into that number, which would really be valuable for taming some of our runaway healthcare costs. So I'm going to shift gears here too, because we're talking about the politics, advocacy politics, political advocacy, and I'm here in DC and spent some time on Capitol Hill. So I'll kind of tell you, this is one of the things when you first come to the Hill, you do a really interesting course over at the Congressional Research Service, CRS, and this is something they teach you, and they provide the orientation to all new members of Congress. And they talk about there's the 3 Ps of successful legislation. And what most people, I think average hardworking Americans would like to think is that, in order to pass legislation, the 3 Ps would be, well, let's make some really good policy. Let's come up with an idea, whether it's about healthcare or something else, and make really good policy. And then the next step would be, what's the procedure? We have to get it through the subcommittee and the committee. And, if you remember that old Schoolhouse Rock thing, and I know most of you are younger than I am, I'm sure, but that little guy that used to talk about, I'm just a bill on Capitol Hill. If you want to YouTube it, it's a pretty cute video, and it's actually very accurate. And it kind of talks about the steps of something going from being a bill to becoming a law. So that's, congressional procedure. And then at the end, of course, there's the political wrangling. And that's how I think most of us would like to prioritize, the steps or the components of successful legislation. But, what is the state in reality? It's actually probably sadly reversed, where politics is usually what is the primary thing that drives things. And if the politics aren't going to work, you can really barely ever get to policy. And so that's why we are, although most Americans want to see home runs in legislation, really we have to think about things more in terms of base hits. And I think, again, that's partly really important to realize, is to think that, small incremental change is probably what's achievable, but it's also additive. And so it's something that you can actually achieve and something that you can build on. So you have to look at the political landscape and say, what is possible? What are some things that garner bipartisan support? Right now we can talk about prescription drug prices, because that's something both sides are kind of agreeing on. So that might be an opportunity where, okay, the politics might be navigable. And then the procedure, because procedure, realize that's a tool. And you've seen that, especially with things like the courts or with approval of nominees on the Senate side. You see procedure being weaponized very commonly on both sides to be able to block things. So there's a lot of procedural, and the Senate has more procedural hurdles than the House, but procedure matters. And it's useful to know about some of those things. And the other things are that's really fundamental that I think will be good for you to be aware of, is we often try to get stuff done in what we call must-pass legislation, because what people will say, the vernacular on the Hill will be, oh, this bill or this idea needs a vehicle. And what that means is you'd never be able to get it through as a standalone bill. It's not a, it's too much political capital for anybody. People aren't gonna do that. But if you can put it with, like as an amendment, as a rider, or embedded within something that's must pass, like, for instance, next week, we have to fund the government. Again, if you're following the news, the government's going to run out of money next week, or our budget will expire. So they're going to have to do something. So those are the kind of things that people will try to get their piece of legislation in that bill, even though it has nothing to do with funding the government. Other big ones are the National Defense Authorization Act, things like that. Those are must-pass things. And so those are procedural hurdles or opportunities. And then, as I got to, at the end of all that, if you can, run that gauntlet successfully, what you try to achieve is have a nugget of good policy left over after these two things to be able to, have something good pass. But that's much more realistic path. So how is that navigated? And again, we all learn about, the separation of powers, and we learn about the traditional three branches. In Washington, there's what we call the iron triangle, which has two of the elements that you'd be familiar with, the legislative branch and the executive branch. But in place of the judicial branch, what you have are stakeholders. And so, here I've just listed, there are literally hundreds, if not thousands, and if you go beyond healthcare, thousands of different stakeholders. These are your, lobbyists, patient groups, you name it. And I'll tell you, because it gives you again, context, there are more registered lobbyists in healthcare in Washington, D.C. than any other sector, more than energy, more than financial services, more than you name it. So you think, gosh, healthcare. And the reason is because, like anything, you can follow the money. So there's 18% of GDP, $3.5 trillion. There's a lot of people. And you can see how people can get very much opposite with each other on these things, right? So these folks are all kind of hearing from these folks. And so at the end, that's kind of how your landscape is. And you have to realize that your message is is competing or collaborating with other people's message. But that's the iron triangle. It's, in the executive branch, obviously you're not talking to the president, but you might be talking to CMS, right? CMS or the FDA or NIH. Those are all executive branch agencies. If there's a cabinet official, it's executive branch. Over here, you're talking about, House and Senate folks. So that's where you're interfacing over here, is with those branches. And then at the end, that's where the famous expression of how the sausage is made, you're trying to get something through this grinder and end up with something at the end. I think when if some of you may have spent some time on the Hill, and you might have been Rutherford Fellows or for any other reason had an opportunity to spend some time in Washington or in your state capital at home, which is actually, I would encourage you to do that, because that's a great opportunity. It's a little bit more like the minor leagues. You can be a bigger fish there. You can get a lot more done. You can probably know a whole lot more and be really impactful and educate folks at your state capital level quite a bit on healthcare. But one of the things that's important when you go talk to those folks is realize that there are very, very, very few people that have any understanding or any background even in healthcare. Elected officials virtually never do. There's only less than 10 physicians in Congress. It's an incredibly small number. Most are attorneys, some are business people. They come from other different walks of life. So what I want to talk about is we tend to think about things a certain way, but I think it's important to understand how they see the world, because what you're trying to do is sort of interpret, because again, this is their world and you're in their world. And so if you can speak the vernacular, it's just like, if a medicine or a surgery resident calls you to consult with you about a patient, you like to hear things in a certain order. You like to hear, I have an 80-year-old, male who's post-op day 2 from, laparoscopic ulcer. They go through things in an SOAP format. And that's how you are conditioned to receive that information. So not only are they conditioned to receive information a certain way, this is sort of the world they live within. So we tend to use the scientific method, right? We look at an issue, well, even if it's policy or scientific, and we kind of come up with a problem statement. We look at what the state of knowledge is about that. We come up with some methods, some ideas on how to study the problem, how to test it. We analyze, our results. We look at the things that we couldn't do that are potential sources of error or pitfalls, and we kind of come up with some sort of synthesis. That's the scientific method that we all have come to know so well. And what they have is similar, but most of them probably don't have a very deep scientific background, but you can kind of make this little translation. And for them, it's the issue. A literature search, which makes sense, so there's a lot of similarity, is kind of current law. So you go, okay, well, what does current law or regulation, which is what it should say as well, say? But then this is where it deviates a little bit, is what are people's positions? And realizing when you're talking to elected officials, particularly those in the legislative branch, first of all, it's helpful if you know what the member thinks, because that's obviously important information to know. Don't go in, and I'll talk about this again in a minute, don't go in and not know. If your member has an opinion on this issue, you should know what it is before you go talk to them. Many of them don't necessarily have a great deal of depth of expertise in healthcare, so they're often kind of going with what the party tells them. And so then you might need to know where they are. And then the third thing is, who are the relevant stakeholders? Because first of all, do they have people? When I was on the Hill, I worked for Fred Upton, who is from southwestern Michigan. And so there was a big Stryker plant and Pfizer in his district. So for him, that's who he represents. So when people came to us to talk about medical device issues or pharma issues, Fred would always want to know, where is Stryker on this? Because those are jobs, those are his voters, those are the people he's there to represent. So that was a uniquely important stakeholder. In the district that I was running in Arizona, BARD was headquartered in my district. So again, very important to know who that is. The Phoenix VA was also in my district. That would be considered a relevant stakeholder, because those veterans and where the hospital is matters. So knowing all those sorts of things will really help you formulate, a much better, conversation. This can't be overstated because of those earlier slides you saw. The budget impact is incredibly important. And so, if your idea costs money, it's going to be very hard to sell right off the bat. So to the best of your ability, and boy, if it costs money, you're really going to have to show some kind of, value in a less measurable way. But this is what, folks get beat up on all the time in government. So you want things usually to be budget neutral or a savings. And then the most important thing at the federal level, especially, is what the staff recommends. That's what you're trying to get, because most of the members will often take a strong lead from their staff. And that's mostly who you're going to talk to. So then when we go on to like values, your career thing. So for a lot of you, especially if you're in your training right now, you're at an academic institution. So you certainly understand that there's pressure on your faculty, and even, now to compete for your subsequent training, to publish. Academics tend to go a mile deep, right? They, you find people that know, they're the world expert on, some very unique medical topic. We use peer review as a way to validate that what we're doing, is scientifically rigorous and valuable. Teaching is an important part of our job. One of the quantifiable ways that you distinguish yourself as an academic is how much research and how much grant money you bring in. Your sort of immediate level politics are probably at your department level. As you move up, you might want to become an endowed chair to be a chairman, or an endowed chair and have tenure. So that's sort of like the life cycle or the career path of an academic. Well, for somebody on the Hill, there's publication as well, but what theirs is all about is what the media is going to say. So the power of the press is very important. So when you pitch an issue to them, they're always going to look at it as, if I support it or I don't support it, how is the media going to accept that? They are voting on issues on everything from, a natural gas pipeline to healthcare, to, some kind of foreign policy thing. So they are, instead of a mile deep, they're a mile wide, but only an inch deep in many, many topics. Instead of peer review, their peers are the public, right? They're public people. So how the public is going to view them is vitally important to them. Instead of teaching, what they do is they get out and they have meet and greets with their constituents. So again, that's back to look at stakeholders. Are there people in their district that they can talk to and they can talk about an issue? And the way they raise money is fundraising. Instead of grant money, it's going out and raising money. And so you have to realize, is your issue going to help or hurt their fundraising? Because that's going to matter to them, because that affects their electability. Instead of the department, it's what's the jurisdiction. In Congress, there's 3 categories of committee. There's A, B, and C. And usually when you're junior, it's hard to get an A committee. A committees are things like, where healthcare, like I was on the Energy and Commerce Committee, which is an A committee. And it's an A committee because we had jurisdiction over the entire energy sector. We had jurisdiction over all of healthcare, over commerce, manufacturing, trade, telecommunications, technology. So you can imagine, if you have jurisdiction over that, one, it's really powerful because you're affecting a lot. But it leads right back to this, because if you're making decisions that are affecting all these industries, those people are all donating money to you. And again, it's a very unsavory situation, to be sure, but that is the reality of how a lot of elected officials will sort of view things through that lens. And what they want to be is they want to be the committee chair, because if they can become the chair of the committee, they control that committee's agenda. And then obviously their primary focus for most of them, most of the time, is making sure that they get reelected, because they can't do any good not in office in the way they sort of see the world. So then the final piece in this little 3-slide, series that I think is kind of gives you some tips on how to be an effective advocate. And this astonished me, because when one of my jobs was to take lobbyists, to be on the receiving end of it, for about 3 to 4 hours a day. That's just part of being, which I think is great. It's part of an open society. People come and they can talk to their members of Congress or their staff about what their issues are. And one of the things, a lot of them, they're from out of state. They come in, they're dressed up. They might have bought a new suit. They come, they're all ready to go. They've got glossy brochures and whatnot. But I was always astonished, because one of the things is they would often know very little about where we were on the issue, what we cared about, what we had already done. And so it would end up becoming a very ineffective meeting for them. They would just basically say what they needed. And when you have 4 hours of meetings in a row every day, and each meeting's 30 minutes, so you're seeing about 8 different stakeholders a day, and they come in and they say, this is what they need, this is what they're going to ask for, and this is why they deserve extra money, or, everyone else should get a cut, but they should be spared. So ultimately a very self-serving kind of message. It's not that compelling, because at the end of the day, you have to make difficult decisions when you're on the policymaking side, and they didn't really persuade you in any way that they're unique or anything. And the other thing it's important to let you know is, most of the time, going in there as physicians, they assume that physicians aren't the people that are vulnerable in our society in their perspective. So again, you can agree or disagree with it, but they sort of see physicians, whether you're a pediatrician or a neurosurgeon, they say, oh, this is a doctor, they're doing well, like that's their bias. But the biggest thing that I was talking about was kind of flying blind, not even doing a little bit of research before you come in. So, which leads going in kind of reverse order, do a Google search, for goodness sake, about who you're going to be talking to, the committee or whatnot, and find out what they've done. You might find out that there's an issue that's really important to them, or they've already done a lot of work on your issue. The other thing is, what it gets back to is up here is, you want to talk about them. When I say about you, I mean you're the speaker, you're talking about them, and you want to offer solutions. People work extraordinarily hard in the legislature, despite, again, what the media might say about them. It's very hard work, very long hours, lots of difficult problems. When you come in and you say, hey, I know this is a problem that you guys have been really grappling with. We appreciate everything you've been doing on it, and I think we have some ideas that might help solve this problem for you. Then they're interested. They're like, ooh, someone's going to come to me and bring me a solution. It's, again, just like when you can help your chief resident when you're an intern, the chief resident appreciates that. If you can save money, that's great. If you can do things that are for the greater good and you're not saying, hey, we're special, then again, I think that's obviously very important. And if you can find somebody outside of yourself, whether it's patients or whether it's, your community or whether it's the economy or, the budget or whatnot, those are all that are going to benefit. Those are all things that you want to emphasize. So that's kind of the way to sort of, avoid these and think about things in that term, and you'll get a lot farther. I'm going to shift gears here a little bit now to talk about, something that is what makes advocacy and what makes organizational stuff challenging. So if you've ever read, it's a pretty tedious read, but it's kind of a classic, is reading The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith in 1776, which is considered like the first book on capitalism and the sort of modern economics, liberalized economic theory, and also relevant because it's ironic, it was published in 1776, obviously a time of a lot of enlightened thinking, and a lot of the people that might have, been writing documents that formed our government had read this. This was a new book at the time. And so Adam Smith talks about something called the endowment effect, and in a great 18th century way, he makes the point to say, no dog ever made a free and fair exchange of one bone for another. And what that means, in the colorful way it's described, is when people have something, they don't want to part with it for something else, no matter what the value, and you can try that at home. If your dog has a bone and you offer them a bone that's as good or better, they will generally not give up the they have. And people behave the same way. That's sort of how so when you're trying to get people to change or to come off of an idea, the endowment effect is something that is pervasive in economics, and it's becoming more well understood, because when you look at things only in that old-fashioned economic style of saying people will always act in their best interest, unfortunately that's not always true, and we're going to talk a little more about that. And again, these are all contextual things that I think are valuable when you're advocating, to realize what some of the barriers are, is that people don't want, no matter how much they complain about what they have, they may still be reluctant to change what they have for something different. So this is somebody that, nice young graduate, a guy named John Nash. And if you saw Beautiful Mind, it's the story about John Nash. So when he was 19 or 20, he wrote a Nobel Prize winning work, which is, amazing, that it's a one-page essay. And he's often considered the founder of game theory. And so again, I'm dating myself because this is a pre-Ferris Bueller, Matthew Broderick movie, but a great movie, War Games, which if you've seen the movie, what it deals with is this computer game, and it talks about mutual assured destruction. So John Nash is an important figure in world history because it was his theory of game theory that talked about that having the concept of mutually assured destruction is what kept the Soviet Union and the United States from ever going to war, because all the outcomes were bad, so neither one would do it. And that became sort of the doctrine of the Cold War, and it actually kept the world out of nuclear war for roughly 50 years. So it is 40 years. So it's pretty amazing. And so he has a concept called the Nash Equilibrium, which, and this sounds pretty weedy, but again, I hope some of you are getting some value out of it, because I think a lot of it relates very well to healthcare, because we come up with a lot of these challenging problems because we're dealing with things like we talked about earlier with limited resources and behavioral economics. So a Nash equilibrium is when a stable outcome results from people or institutions making rational choices based on what they think others will do. And part of the reason this is relevant is because so much of healthcare is based on fee for service, which again, in this town where I am, is considered anathema. And that's like what so many people think is one of the main drivers for our expensive healthcare system, is because of fee for service, and they want to end it. And that's why you saw these alternative payment models and these other things come out of the Affordable Care Act and bundles and whatnot. The problem with all that is it's because it makes sense. I think they can see what they're trying to get at is, well, if you pay people more to do more, they tend to do more. That's what the fundamental premise of fee for service, or the pitfall, is. So we're going to bundle it. But if you take it to the next step, you go, well, then people will do more bundles. So again, it becomes a very challenging problem, because people throughout history have found ways to kind of work around these systems. So one of the things the Nash Equilibrium talks about is that no one can better their own condition by changing strategy. So again, if we use, the nuclear standoff as one, changing the strategy of saying, we're going to have our stuff and keep it, and they're going to have their stuff and keep it. We're just kind of keep ourselves poised. Actually, nobody was being bombed. So our condition was good, and if either of us had changed the strategy, both sides recognized their condition would have gotten worse. So that's an extreme example. A more common economic example is you're selling something, you and I are selling widgets for $10 each, and we both make, a 20% profit. And so I decide, I want to get more market share, so I'm going to lower my price to $9, and I'm going to steal some of your market share, and I figure I'll make it up in volume. Well, as soon as you see me do that, you might lower yours to $8.50, because remember the break-even point was $8. And so we're changing strategy, and we're both actually ending up worse off. So that Nash equilibrium means the market, if you will, found its sort of equilibrium at, say, $10. And that's sort of what that means. So all actors are doing as well as they can, even if it doesn't produce the best outcome for society. And that's the bolt that I think is so important for healthcare, right? Because that's exactly one of the things that is the challenge. And we're going to talk about things like the tragedy of the commons in a few minutes, because again, I think that's something that's very relevant to healthcare. So what this does is it expands economic theory that we talked about before to where decision-making matters. And the classic example of game theory is the prisoner's dilemma, which is, you have two people. This is your situation where they have two suspects in separate interrogation rooms, and the policeman goes to each one and makes a deal with both of them, either confess or keep quiet, and with varying things. And so you can see it forms like a Punnett square. And so, you can either go to jail for 10 years if you confess. If one person turns on the other, one gets prison, one goes free. There's these various scenarios. So, what is the correct answer? So looking at that, well, the correct answer is actually to confess. And this is the only course of action that will reliably avoid a lifetime in jail. Otherwise, you could end up with a life in jail. But obviously what you're wondering is if you knew what the other person was thinking, then it would be particularly helpful. And so this has been studied for decades, and universities do it all the time, either in their psychology, their economics department, or whatnot. 50% of people will get this wrong on the first attempt, but if they're allowed to do it 10 times and they start to see the various outcomes, only 10% get it wrong once they've done it 10 times. But again, this is valuable because usually you don't get to play 10 times. So when we're trying to do stuff, if we're going to get it wrong half the time on the first, if we're only going to get one attempt, we can't afford to be a coin toss, right? So we've got to think through things, and we have to use a little game theory to try to think ahead before we decide, because otherwise we end up with something where the laws of unintended consequence hurt us more than we ever intended, with our best intentions. And this is, again, I think a very apt thing to talk about with healthcare is that the behavior of self-improving individuals can lead to self-harming crowds. For those of you who, follow SIR Connect, you might have noticed, a few weeks ago, I think it was, there was, a discussion going on about iliac vein stenting. Iliac vein stenting has become a fairly common thing, and people were talking about it. And I can tell you, I trained in the late 90s, around 2000, and May Thurner was almost like semi-reportable. We didn't talk about it much. And now, granted, our level of knowledge, our ability to image, our knowledge about the disease has improved. But there's the other component of that is people, certainly there was somebody who posted that the rate of iliac vein stenting in Florida has gone up 11,000%. So these are self-improving individuals, right? So they're saying, hey, I'm just going to make the money. It's an easy procedure. I'm going to put in an iliac vein stent, and I'm going to collect my whatever, and I'm going to say there was a problem. But what is that? Not only the harm to the patient, but even to everyone else who's doing good work. And we saw that happen recently with hemodialysis, which hemodialysis, the top few codes in hemodialysis are the most commonly billed codes amongst people who self-report as interventional radiologists. Well, in 2017, the composite of those codes, if you averaged, the cut, it was 38%. It was enormous. And that's because there are so many people that were abusing those codes. And so people that were improving themselves led to self-harming crowds. So not only did they make people that were doing good work and being ethical lose almost 40% of their income, it harmed patients because there's places who, they couldn't afford to keep their doors open. So it affected access adversely, it affects a lot of things. So I think it's a really important thing to realize. So the policy challenge, this is where I know this was like thank you for bearing with me during this detour, but the policy challenges are to align the incentives to mitigate these outcomes to the best of your ability. And the other thing that's particularly relevant with this audience, for probably most of you that are in your, training years, the residency match system was specifically devised to overcome a bad Nash equilibrium. Because that example I gave about, the $10 widgets, that was what was happening with the residency and the fellowship process. Is the most competitive applicants and the most competitive programs got into like an arms race with each other to keep committing to other places earlier because there was no system. And so, nobody wanted to be left out. So everybody was moving the timeline to the left. And what's clearly happening is some places are not getting the best applicants they could have got because they decided to go with what they had early. Other places, they're not going to as good of a program, but they just wanted to take what they got. You can see all the problems with it. So the match system was designed to sort of fix that. And it also relies on people having some insight into sort of what their market value is. Because if you are a middle of the road applicant and you only rank, top 5 percentile places, you might end up worse off. So it relies on, and that's kind of like anything in economics, you kind of have to know, you're the product, and you sort of have to know the value of you as a product. And so I think it is a better way of trying to match up like and like, which I think, in terms of quality and match and lifestyle and everything that people are looking for. So it's overall a good thing. And it's actually now being thrown out as a possible alternative to the whole college application system, because that's been, for obvious reasons, has come under a lot of scrutiny in the last year or two for a whole number of reasons where there are a ton of problems with it. And so there are folks who are pitching, they're saying, hey, in medicine, they do this residency match. That might be something that needs to be done for undergraduate admissions. So again, all opportunities to overcome a bad Nash equilibrium. So the question for this purpose of this talk is, can these kind of ideas be applied to a payment system? And, probably not perfectly, but those are the kind of things that are aspirational or that we're trying to achieve, is to try to avoid these bad equilibriums where we end up creating things. And I told you before I was going to talk about the tragedy of the commons, so I'll talk about it in a second. So to tell you a little bit about one of the biggest issues in healthcare for about 20 years was something called this SGR, the sustainable growth rate. And it was implemented in 1997, very well intentioned. It was a way to control Part B spending. And all it did was it set a roof on how much the physician fee schedule could go up. And it was tied to things like medical economic inflation and whatnot. And so if as a whole, Medicare Part B, which is all outpatient healthcare, Medicare, was under the curve, everybody got a raise. And if it was over the curve of what was projected should have happened, they got a cut. Well, it happened that the economy was pretty good and whatnot for about 5 years. So actually, physicians were getting raises for the first several years. So needless to say, nobody complained about this system. But then what happened in 2002 when they did the retrospective look, they kind of broke the bank actually by a fair amount. So it's in law, so it was triggered to say now if you got $100 on December 31st, you got $95.40 on January 1st, 4.6% cut across the board. Physicians had like a mutiny. They said, we're not going to work, we're going to strike. You know, they threatened Congress that they would stop seeing seniors and not allow Medicare. So Congress had a, panic, and they said, okay, so they did like the doc fix. That's what used to be called the doc fix. And so that continued indefinitely because they basically broke the bank like every single time from then on. And because it's in law, they had to continue to just do these patches and say that at some point they have to make the program whole. So by 2014, when I was on the Hill, in order to sort of fix the problem, they were effectively deficit spending. Doctors would have to get a 25% pay cut. That's how much this had ballooned. And that was already after throwing $158 billion into the kitty to help, patch it. So 16 separate, because sometimes they'd be a month or two, sometimes they'd be a year. But over the course of, about 12 to 13 years, there were 16 different fixes. So, and this came up all the time, and you never knew until the day before, they would do the fix. It'd always be like a midnight fix. But it made it hard to run a practice because if you thought you might get, a 10, a 15, a 20% pay cut the next year, are you going to hire new staff? Can you hire new techs? Can you buy that new imaging equipment and all those sorts of things? So basically, it has a very chilling effect on the ability for people to run a practice because they just can't with that kind of uncertainty. And so one of the problems, as we talked about earlier, was that the fee-for-service system. So it puts everybody in the same boat. And so this goes into the game theory thing of nobody actually ever felt responsible or felt they could alter the system. So everybody acted as a self-interested individual, and none were compelled to try to contain the cost. They said, hey, all these other people are misbehaving. Why should I be the judicious one? Because if we get in trouble, we're all going down, so I might as well get mine too. And if you're familiar with the story of the tragedy of the commons, what that relates to is common grazing territory for animals like sheep, where people, these municipalities would come up with these things, and I forget if this was like in England or Scotland or Ireland, and they'd say, okay, they'd have these common areas, and the idea was it would be shared, everybody would contribute to it. But what happens is what people's motivations were is you get as many of your animals over there to eat the grass as quickly as possible first, and then you benefit the most. And so before you know it, all of the pasture is like totally used up. And so now no one has the benefit of any of it. So it was called the tragedy of the commons. And so fee for service is kind of like that. Everybody takes a scorched earth policy and says, well, CMS is going to cut this at some point, so I might as well, get as much of this as I can before they do. And you can see why that creates a vicious cycle or a race to the bottom. So these policy challenges, how do we overcome them, and how do we come up with things to come up with better ideas? Well, the most important thing, and I think our field has come a long way in the last 10 to 20 years, is to get better data. Data are important not only because they help us make better decisions, but they help us make policy recommendations that are backed up with more than just emotion or gestalt. There's actually true data behind that. The other huge thing that can't be overestimated is the importance of relationships and when there's trust and whatnot, because at the end of the day, if you're seen as a valued and an honest broker, when you talk about these things, and over time, where every recommendation you make isn't in your self-interest, that helps build trust. And people get to know that you're out for sort of the long term. You have shared goals, things we talked about before. That makes a big difference, because most people don't invest. Most of your counterparts that are advocating are not going to invest in relationships. They're going to be mostly self-interested. So this is something that will distinguish you. And then obviously one of the most important things is to innovate. And that's why I think as IRs, we have such a tremendous natural advantage, because it's what we do, it's who we are. And so much of what we do is innovative, that it's just sort of the way we're wired to think about things and to be natural problem solvers. So what are some of the success stories? So when we use data to back the evidence of the value proposition, and so I think one of the easiest ones, and this isn't an IR example, and ours are more difficult, and that's a challenge, but that's why it's great to have, smart young people looking at these problems and thinking outside the box and thinking of things that we can do to sort of codify and capture data that we haven't, up to now. But so right lower quadrant abdominal pain, and again, I'm going to date myself to talk about when I was a surgery intern and medical student in the early 90s. All of us carried this book around, this Cope's Early Diagnosis of Acute Asthma. Look at that, 1921. We did a history, we did physical, we did blood work, and if a patient met the criteria based on these things, we took them to the operating room and we let the pathologist make the diagnosis. And it was in many ways like a BI-RADS metric for your surgery department, that if greater than 20% of the appendices that you removed weren't normal, then that actually meant that your sensitivity was too low. You were probably missing some. So 20%. So if you did 100, you used to do a lot of appendectomies. You're busy, but if you did 120, you're taking out at least 20 normals. So what do we do now? Well, now we do a history, physical, and blood work. So that part stays the same. And then what do patients get? They get a CT scan. And the pathologist doesn't make the diagnosis, the radiologist does long before the patient goes to surgery, right? So it's extremely rare for a patient to go to the OR and have a normal appendectomy, right? They only go to the OR if the CT is positive. And the false positive rate, so now we're talking more about specificity and stuff, is very small. So what we have come to is cut down on the number of laparoscopies, and this is extrapolated to many other things. But one of the beauties of this is, and part of the point of this is to show the value, because when policymakers look at imaging, they go, gosh, look how much we spend on CT scans. But then if we take this to the next level and we show them what some of the implications are, and we say that every single year in America, just for this one diagnosis, that many fewer negative explorations. That's tremendous. And that's, that many hospital days. If a hospital day is $1,000, add 3 zeros to that, $4.5 billion in savings. And that's, and they're more than $1,000. And then these patients, there's going to be people that get complications. There's going to be people that get adhesions because of these. So 10, 20 years down the road, they're going to get small bowel obstructions. They're going to get all these other issues that we all know about. So it's a very easy sell. On a slightly different thing, and this was a big victory recently, was we're talking about how many lives were saved every year from lung and breast cancer screening, because they were going to cut that reimbursement. They weren't going to allow that. They weren't going to pay for that. And so this was something that was a little less monetary, but when you could talk about 40,000 lives, I mean, that's more than the number of people that are killed on the highway or even killed by gun violence in America. Those are both under 40,000. So 40,000 people is all the highway deaths or all the gun deaths in America are saved every year from lung and breast cancer screening. So that's an enormous, statement to be able to make. Here's a couple articles that was put out by the Neiman Health Policy Institute, Rich Dusak and a lot of those other folks, is what they were going to do for those of you. And again, a lot of this is diagnostic radiology stuff, but I know that affects all of us too. It wasn't very long ago that there was this thing called MPPR that you might be familiar with, multiple procedure payment reduction. So if you do a chest, abdomen, pelvis, you get paid full for the chest, they reduce it for the abdomen, and they reduce it again for the pelvis. And so, the numbers they were going to use was they were going to take each one down 25%. So by the time, and now also the other thing they were doing was, if you got a brain CT and a right upper quadrant ultrasound, which sounds maybe ridiculous or unrelated, but for all of you taking call for the ER, I'm sure you see that without that much irregularity, you still got a cut. It was like two things. which you're like, what? There's no efficiency, there's no anything in that. How is that possible? But they were just going to do it anyway. But because of the value of those papers, where we actually said, oh, we agreed, and there's a little bit of efficiency. In fact, I think the analogy that I used to like to use that was really valuable for folks was I would tell them, because they don't really understand what we do. So I would say, look, if I had to read an entire anthology of Shakespeare, all the plays and all the poems, I've got to read them all, no matter what. Whether they're in separately bound books or whether they're all bound in one giant anthology, I've got to read all the words. So whether I'm reading a chest, abdomen, pelvis, that's the same to me as reading 3 plays. Now, is there a slight benefit on if they're in 1 book instead of 3 books? Yeah, I'll give you that because there's less binding and whatnot, the process. So there you have it. So there's a little bit of value, and you only put the patient on the table once. You only put their name in once. You only retrieve their old studies once. So there is a little bit of value, but it wasn't a 25% efficiency. It was much closer to this, and it prevailed. And they went, we really appreciate that you have data, that you were able to explain it in a way we can now understand, and we actually agree with you. And so by reducing that cut from 25% to 5%, that's $352 million in savings over 10 years, or money that was recouped in fees, in reimbursement. And so based on how many radiologists are in America, that's what that ends up being. So that's not an insignificant amount of revenue. And again, the other way I would always try to talk about these things, and I mentioned it earlier when I talked about sympathetic causes, not all the causes are patients or this or that. One of the things that, I always found to be really valuable was to remind policymakers that in many ways we're small business owners. So if, when you run a physician practice, you have nurses, you have techs, you have MAs, you have administrative support staff, and all those people, the only thing that generates your product is what you collect for the imaging or the interventional services you perform. So when they cut those, this $16,000 might not have gone, that's what the radiologist, but that might be paying, half of your receptionist's salary or something. And the problem is, so if you had a 10-person radiology group and $160,000, you might have had to lay off, 3 techs. So you tell people this is protecting jobs, and that always resonates with those folks. This isn't protecting, the second house of what they perceive as the fat cat radiologist. This is money that is going to people that might have an associate's degree or a bachelor's degree, have families, have kids in school, and that's who you're really helping. And I think those are the stories that are compelling. This isn't about us. This is about how we can serve our patients, how we can serve our community, how we can serve our employees. And I think as advocates, radiologists have a lot of natural advantages and natural talents. I mean, first of all, we're natural problem solvers. That's what we do, not only on the diagnostic side and on the interventional side. Interventional side, I think, is even more robust. But the other thing we learn in our diagnostic training is synthesis, right? You take all this kind of these, pieces of information, and we kind of create and we put them into a package, for folks. We also are in the habit of, we are a service-oriented specialty. We try to help other people, take care of their patients too. I mean, that's naturally who we are. And I think we're good at it, and that's something that we excel at. And I think that's a value in this. We're also natural conveners, whether it's Tumor Board, whether it's other multidisciplinary conferences. Again, I'm dating myself a little bit, but we're talking about like meeting in the reading room, those things, whether they happen in person or whether they happen virtually, the imaging is often a focal point upon which we can have really robust discussions about patients and their issues. And so it's a skill that I think we're particularly good at. We build bridges, we bring the medicine people and the surgical people together. Again, we're sort of the conduit. So I think all those things are incredibly valuable, core competencies for us that make us very good advocates. And back to what I alluded to a little bit earlier, don't think of this as only a toolbox for advocating with government. These, as you probably gleaned, I mean, these are all sort of just skills on how to be a good advocate, and whether you're advocating on behalf of your division to your department chair, you know, on behalf of your department of the hospital, your medical community, to local and state government, or, you know, on behalf of your hospital or your specialty, to payers or the healthcare system. You see how all these same principles continue to apply, because what it mostly boils down to is being a good communicator, understanding problems, understanding like what those people's issues are and how you add value and how you help solve problems, and so forth. And so I think that's where all these things can be particularly of use in our field. So I think with that, it looks like it's about 9 o'clock. So I'm going to wrap up this part and take any questions.
I think Joel has a question. Thank you so much, Dr. Ferrara. This was amazing. So many learned.
Oh, no, yeah. No.
Joel, you're on mute right now. Do you want to ask your question?
Oh, yeah, sure. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Ferrara. That was a very insightful talk. A lot of stuff I had a lot of questions about. It's obvious that fee-for-service has a great potential for abuse, but also when we discuss inappropriate requests or orders with referring clinicians, we tend to feel that a lot of these are driven by defensive medicine, which is influenced by high patient expectations and the fear of medical lawsuits.
Yep.
Is there a role for political advocacy in defending medicine as a whole body, and potentially realigning incentives among all specialties, maybe decreasing wasteful expenditure and contributing to the greater good of the community?
Yep. No, that's a really, I'm glad you brought that point up, because that is a very important point. And I will tell you, this is a very politically, meaning sort of this kind of gets to be a left-right or a, you know, red-blue issue when it comes to tort reform, because you're absolutely right. If you talk to one side, they will say that the costs of defensive medicine are minuscule, because what they'll do is they'll just say, oh, what's the total number of dollars paid out in suits, and that's what they attribute the number to. But as you described very eloquently, that's not at all what the real, because the real cost is all the unnecessary things. And I, you know, I think as all of us, we don't necessarily, you know, if I had to do a shift in the emergency department and a child came in with, you know, they had a 4-foot fall under their head and they have a headache, are you going to be the ER doctor that doesn't get a head CT? You know, you're a lot of a chance, and so you just scam, even though you know it's not. So I think we all see that. So that those dollars aren't even attributed to that. And the way I can tell you that it's a politically challenging topic is there was a lot of there's a lot of things that the Affordable Care Act did that paved new areas that needed to be opened up to discussion, which are really good, including serving more people. Fundamentally, that's probably was its primary goal, and something that it made a high priority, which is great. And also innovative things, you know, to different practice models. But one thing that, if you'll notice, is conspicuously absent is there was zero tort or medical liability reform, because that was a political issue that couldn't get across the finish line. And so, but that doesn't mean that it's dead, and that's something that I think is really important. And so now I think the advocacy opportunity here is for a couple things. I think what a lot of folks, including people like Zeke Emanuel, who I don't agree with, and he doesn't really like radiology very much, but at least, and that's kind of where we can have common ground even, is even he advocates for things like safe harbors. And I think those are areas that we might have an opportunity to go, look, if you follow, evidence-based guidelines, and now we can have them computerized. We have clinical decision support and whatnot. And if a person follows those things and does those things properly, they can have a safe harbor. And because it's a bridge too far to say that patients going to be able to sue, because that's not going to happen. And I don't think any of us think that should, because people that are truly harmed by negligence should have the opportunity to have their day in court. I don't think any of us disagree with that. But what we're trying to do is say that if people, if physicians and the healthcare system follows, sound judgment and evidence-based guidelines, then they should feel some sense of security that they won't be, that they won't be victim of a frivolous lawsuit. And so I think there are opportunities there for exactly things like that, because you're 100% right. Defensive medicine drives a lot of spending, and it also makes patients. And you're back to being right. That's a tough one too. And so here's, healthcare is so layered, because one of the things, and this was something that the Affordable Care Act, I think, wisely tried to take on, and it's been battered back and forth since 2010, March 23rd, when that bill was signed into law, was things like, if you've heard of these Cadillac plans, and most people even hear those things in political debates, and even people that are pretty savvy about healthcare don't necessarily know why we talk about those. And part of the reason we talk about those is, one, it's a big untaxed benefit for people, so it kind of rewards people and it screws up the tax system. But number two is it's proven. I mean, we know that we have reams of data to show this, that people that have the more generous of a health insurance plan you give people, the more health care in. So because partly it's, the fact that people have no connection, if their health insurance is they never have to pay a penny, they tend to use more and they want more. They go and they go, hey, I have this great health insurance, I want an MRI. And if they pressure that to do an MRI, the physician is in a position to either get a bad rating or just do the MRI, right? And so the incentives are screwed up. As is what we, the incentives are not aligned with, the patient has very little clinical indication for the MRI. They're doing it because they want to take advantage of their healthcare benefit. And they kind of get this sense of security over saying the MRI was negative, but it costs the healthcare system money. So these are a lot of the challenge in the process of advocacy is education. And it's explaining to these policymakers sort of how these things work. And to the extent that you can personalize it, and this sounds, again, this is anathema to most of the stuff we do, because we think of things like case reports and anecdotes as the worst quality data. So we tend to, value things like, prospective randomized trials. Well, that doesn't really exist in the policy world. But what is very compelling are stories. That's why you always hear politicians telling stories. Yesterday I met with Brenda and she was telling me about blank, or, and it doesn't matter what it's about. That's how they relate things. And so when you understand that, whether you agree with it or not, again, you have to sort of know how to be persuasive and how to speak it in sort of language that resonates. And those kind of things help. So if you can come up with things to go, look, these are situations where these people are consuming this much, or, bring a paper in and say, the people with no deductible, no copay, here's how much, here's what they consumed, and you can adjust it for age and gender and comorbidities, versus people that had very high deductible, they come in at the last minute, they're sick, they have bad outcomes, and whatnot. So those are really bad. So we could talk about this for a long time too, because it's very, like I said, it's very layered. But did that answer at least part of your question?
Yes, I did. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ferrara.
Sure.
We have one more question from Caleb. Let me try to unmute him. Caleb, you're unmuted right now if you want to ask it.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, hi, Caleb.
Hey. Hey, thanks for the great talk. I was wondering if on Washington, if the term money talks is true, how can a specialty like IR that's so small in scope really have an influence and say, is it better to go through the ACR despite some policy differences, or to try and have our own voice independently from them?
Yeah, that's a good question, because one thing I probably didn't do a good enough job talking about is the importance of coalitions. So the answer to your question is all of the above. So we should have our own voice, but we should try to align ourselves with absolutely, everybody that shares our point of view to the extent possible on any particular issue that we're pursuing. Because at the end of the day, it's money, but it's also numbers, and whether it's, votes and dollars and things like that, they will always look at. So when we were doing SGR reform, one of the reason we ended up getting it to pass. So we repealed SGR, which had failed for 13 years. And it ended up being $200 billion for us to do that, which was unheard of, but it passed out of our committee 51-0. And although I said it was impossible, you never do policy, procedure, politics, that's what we ended up doing. And it was somehow we were actually able to make it work. But part of what made it work too was we really got a lot of stakeholders on board, and it was incredibly labor intensive for us, but we held a lot of public commenting periods. Every time we would make changes to the draft legislation, we would publish it and we would ask for comment. And I'd have to read that. I mean, I'd get reams and reams and reams and reams of comments from every stakeholder, every physician group in the country you could possibly hear of. And one of the things that was the most compelling was we would always know how many members every one of those groups had. And so the American College of Physicians, ACP, they're over 100,000. So we know that. We're like, ooh, ACP. Reason why AMA is sort of a misleading, because they have a pretty big membership, although they don't represent very many doctors. But that's why part of what they do is they try to pad their membership numbers so they can say how many members. And the people who don't know any better, even in Washington, don't necessarily, they think those are all doctors, but they're not, because they're not going to disclose that. But this is all kind of, again, a long way of saying, though, coalitions are really powerful. And the more diverse they are, the better. And when I say diverse, I mean in every possible, any way you can think of adding diversity, that's good. Because what it does is it helps fend off opposition that might come from a different camp. So if you have a diverse basis of support, then when you have other people that may, because there's always going to be somebody it's back to that pie and that somewhat zero-sum game. If it's good for you, it's probably going to be bad for somebody else. Somebody's either making too much money on it, or they're making, or they're making an okay amount, they're going to make less, or whatever. So they're going to come after you. But if you have a diverse and a broad base of support, it's harder for them to, get as much leverage from you. And so, I think one thing, and again, in broad terms, so these are generalizations, but, if you're talking to Democratic policymakers, they tend to, it's more powerful if you have patients. So you bring in patient groups. That's really powerful. If you can come to Washington to say you wanted to talk about whether it was PAD or whether it was pelvic congestion syndrome or uterine fibroid embolization, bring a patient. If you have a patient that will come, that will tell that loves you and, you changed their life, if he or she is willing to come with you and tell their story, that's huge, because it's a story, it's a real person, it's somebody that has nothing to gain from this, and it's very powerful. And especially with people, and then a lot of groups have, especially more like rare diseases or cancer, for sure. I mean, part of the reason why breast cancer has been effective is they've been very, very good at organizing, right? I mean, they're very organized. And so they get a lot of political leverage, and good for them, because they've done an excellent job of organizing, the public, the policy, everything around their initiative. And so that's, I think, what is really valuable. So the answer is all of the above. There's nobody that you won't, when you're going before those folks, you make, friends out of former enemies if you can align on something. So
That was great. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you, Dr. Ferrara.
Oh, yes, sorry. I'll
And I guess last question from me, which is kind of continuation of previous question. Except for the medical societies, what other organizations are most aligned in policies with IR?
So there's some very large, medical device like AdvaMed, and most of the, there's, the medical device folks. There's even, so most of the companies, the big vendors, Medtronic or Boston Scientific, they actually will all have their own lobbying. They'll either hire lobbyists, they'll generally have their own government relations people, so you can work with them, especially if you're talking about a procedure that uses, their stuff. And then there are also patient groups. I can tell you when I was working on stuff related to both fistula first for end-stage renal disease, chronic CKD, and also PAD, even a bigger one for PAD. We had a lot of, very good results from going and talking to, on the congressional side, the Congressional Black Caucus. And the reason is because when you look at the healthcare disparities that affect African Americans, that can be its own thing, right? So we can look at things you do, and if you're in a disease process that it has, a large healthcare disparity, you can get folks that represent that population. So they're not necessarily in healthcare, but you can get, whether it's, the NAACP or local churches or anything, to say, look, it's really important that, African Americans, they have an amputation rate that's like double what whites have. And so, it's multifactorial, but if your initiative is to try to help close that gap, then you can often get folks like that to really help. And they have inroads to, again, like to groups even within Congress, like the Congressional Black Caucus, and you can get them to come together and say, hey, this is some legislation that we can't cut the reimbursement on this or whatnot, because this is something that's really important to, our community. And it's really powerful. And so you can find, you have to sort of think of, you have to open the aperture on your patients or your procedure or your issue. Open the aperture on your issue and think, who are the stakeholders, and how many different ways can you kind of, parse things and find areas where you can find, people that would have an interest, and go, who else would be upset if, we took 2 steps backwards on this, and then go to those folks. They don't have to be medical. They can be faith-based. They could, they can come from anywhere, really. So,
Thank you.
MF, when I was on the Hill was when CCSVI was still, kind of a bigger thing before. And so the MS population was extremely organized. They wanted reimbursement for that because, so that's where I tell those kind of patient advocacy groups, cancer is very good at it. And there's other pockets of it. But like I said, if you're working hard to get rid of things that affect people socioeconomically, you can build a really powerful, a really compelling coalition around, socioeconomic healthcare disparities, because they exist, they're problematic, and they love having a physician to be an advocate, and you're going to gain a lot by being able to have, their sort of grassroots efforts as well.
Thank you, Dr. Ferrara. I guess this all aligns in one theme of being a solution, not a problem, when we're advocating for any of the
right.
any of the policies.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's, if you're going to take away one thing, that's it.
Yes, but I think we're running out of time, and we seem to answer most of the questions. So I'm really thankful for this webinar. It was amazing. We learned such a huge amount of information about advocacy, health policy, IR leadership. And I would like to also thank everyone for joining us tonight and for all the great questions, Joel and Caleb. For those who could not join this webinar from the beginning, we will be posting the recorded version on RFS YouTube channel. And I would encourage everyone to stay tuned about our next webinar on becoming a great leader with Dr. Feindeis and Dr. Marks.